Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It's wonderful to have you all here. Full house. This event sold out about 5 minutes after it went on sale, and that shows the times that we're in. I want to first start off by acknowledging traditional owners in the land on which we meet this evening. The Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, traditional owners of the land, and I acknowledge any traditional owners of the land who are with us tonight and their leaders past, present and emerging. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to see Pankaj Mishra. I'm going to introduce him in a minute, but please acknowledge his presence here tonight. I could say many things about him, which I shall, but let me just read the bio in the back of his book, because I presume he approved this. This is his new book, which we're talking about tonight, The World After Gaza, which could not be more timely, to put it mildly. His previous books include Age of Anger and From the Ruins of Empire. He contributes political and literary essays to The Guardian, the London Review of Books, the New York Review of Books and the New Yorker. In 2024, he was awarded the Western International Award and he's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and he lives in London. Now let me just briefly explain the format of this evening. There'll be about 45 minutes of conversation between us. Then there'll be questions. Now, I understand that there's a system, which you've been told about, I hope, which is basically a way that you can send a question to us via your phone. Does that make sense to people who I'm speaking to here? Yes? Then it's moderated, then I will ask some amazingly erudite questions to the gentleman here, and then we'll go from there. At the end of the event, there'll be a signing. Both of us will be signing books, but you're really here to see him, not me anyway, let's face it. The books are available at the back of the room, and then we'll be signing upstairs. I'll tell you more about it at the end. Now, in some ways, when we talk about this issue of Israel and Palestine, the world after Gaza, although clearly what's happening in Gaza is far from past tense, it is still happening today. I'll get to this book in a minute. But, Pankaj, I wanted to ask you mentioned in the book about your 2008 visit to Palestine, and I presume Israel, and how that was quite a transformative visit. Talk a little bit about why that is, because some people in the audience may have been to Palestine, I suspect most have not. Why was that visit important, and what transformed your understanding by being there?
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you all for coming this evening. I think, if I were to think about the person who went to Israel and Palestine in 2008, I can see someone who had been worked upon by various sort of historical narratives. And the first one really was the narrative of Zionism. I was exposed to it as a very young person in India. We, in our family of Hindu nationalists, were great admirers of the state of Israel. And I kind of, imbibed this particular narrative of Israel being an admirable model for us in India, people in India who were failing to create a strong nation state or even have a strong sense of nationality, a strong sense of, ethnic, religious, national identity. There was Israel to look up to. So for a long time, that was the narrative I was exposed to, which I internalized. And then, of course, I grew up, started to come into contact with Palestinians, of which there were many in India in the 1980s. Even in small cities in India, there were Palestinian students, often people who had been displaced or whose families had been displaced by Israel in 1948, and who were then living in places like Kuwait or Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and they had come as medical students or engineering students. So from them, I kind of began to imbibe a completely different narrative, a narrative of dispossession, continuous dispossession, in fact. And then I started to read, obviously, when I went to university in the subject, my curiosity expanded. So by the time I went to Israel and Palestine, I had actually read quite widely, had read, all the sort of major books, major scholarship that had appeared on the occupation, in particular its mechanics. I was still, I have to say, I realize now, looking back upon it, there was still a great deal of sympathy, I think, for the state of Israel. And that perhaps also accounts for the great shock and sadness and horror that I felt after witnessing the state of occupation, the regime of occupation. I was speaking to someone earlier today, and I was explaining that it wasn't, I didn't really witness any spectacular acts of violence while I was there in the West Bank. What I saw was far more insidious than what people around the world have been exposed to in the last 15 months. This was structural violence. This was everyday violence that practically everyone in the population of the West Bank suffered on a daily basis. Daily humiliations, daily deprivations, having in places like Hebron, this is all extremely well known to people who've been there, the inability enforced, of course, by Israeli soldiers to walk on certain streets, walk down certain lanes in bazaars and markets, and the impunity with which the Israeli settler population behaved or sort of enforced their will. All this was really profoundly shocking to me. So I came back, of course, with the resolve to write about this. I was obviously not the only person to feel this way after visiting the place, but I think, as I say in the book, I don't go into it at great length, but I felt my efforts to write about it were frustrated by editors, by American editors primarily, who felt that I didn't really have the right credentials for this kind of subject, and that it was better left to the people who were already writing for them on this subject.
Like Tom Friedman, God help us, yeah. Now, the book begins with a long examination of how the Holocaust in Nazi Europe defined 20th and 21st centuries' views on genocide, the mechanized form, of course, of mass slaughter, and it also informs how many Jews themselves see themselves and Israel. You write, and I quote, "For many Jews who have grown up with the knowledge that the Jewish population of Europe was almost entirely wiped out for no reason other than it was Jewish, the world cannot but appear fragile," end quote. And yet, as you also say, it was clear from October 7, 2023, that Israel was going to unleash hell on Gaza, and many, if not most, mainstream Jewish organisations in the US, UK and also in Australia backed Israel's response wholeheartedly. Of course, there were dissidents, there were critics, of which, of course, I am one amongst many. How do you think this has impacted the wider community's view, the non-Jewish community's view of Jews, when there is seemingly for many Jewish organisations no difference between Israel, Netanyahu, and Jews themselves?
I think it's a very dangerous conflation, and I think we should do everything we can to clarify that there are millions of Jews living outside the state of Israel, many of them with no connection whatsoever, in many cases, many of them with no sympathies whatsoever with the current regime or its policies. But at the same time, mainstream organizations in the UK or in the US continue to insist, and of course they're helped by mainstream politicians in this country and indeed the United States, who continue to conflate the two and again expose people living far away, very far away from Israel, to the rage of people who think that they are to be held responsible for what happens in Israel and Palestine. It's one of the most dangerous, one of the most sort of, I would say, pervasive threats to social harmony and peace in so many societies around the world today. I mean, I think, and there are, of course, as you say, many organizations who go to great extent to distinguish themselves or to, define a very clear distance between themselves and their views and the increasingly far-right Israeli regime. But these are not the ones that the mainstream media talks about much. These are not people with access to influential mainstream politicians. And so their voices are drowned out when I would wager to say that they probably represent a majority of Jewish opinion in many of these countries.
You write near the beginning that, quote, no disaster compares to Gaza in recent years in the scale of passion and outrage around the world. And I think to some extent that's true based on the protests we've seen in multiple countries around the world. But I wanted to ask you in relation to that, for those of us who are a bit older, we remember, after 9/11 there was mass protests about Iraq. Afghanistan to lesser extent around Iraq. The death toll in Iraq, for example, is far, far greater than Gaza, which is not to minimise Gaza by any means, of course, but Iraq was profoundly transformative for the Middle East and I would argue the world. So I guess I want to ask you in relation to that, if one, and I'm not suggesting you're doing this, but if one is trying to hold people to account for what happens in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria, committed by Israel, if no one has been held to account, which they basically haven't, for what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, in the US and Australia, in the UK, what does that mean for trying to hold people accountable? That could be legally, that could be even in the media, that could be why people who mostly supported every failed war of failing up in American editors. I mean, this is often mentioned in the book, which I was happy about, The Atlantic magazine, that appalling magazine edited by Jeffrey Goldberg, who, for those who don't know, used to be in the IDF and wrote a book about working at an IDF prison camp. I mean, that's his words, not mine. He's the editor of The Atlantic magazine, supported the Iraq War, supported countless other wars. So talk a little bit about what that means for accountability when no one really has been held to account, with a few notable exceptions in the last decades, for any of these foreign wars, of which Gaza is the most recent.
I think, the failure of the protests against the war in Iraq, I think it broke something in many people who participated in those protests. I think it brought home to them the horrible fact that dissent in democratic societies doesn't really amount to much anymore. And that a war could be prosecuted on, pure fraud, which is what the Iraq War was, and that you can make all kinds of fantastical claims that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and that he was, he had there were weapons. I mean, I remember being in the UK at the time, and the kind of stories that were being floated by 10 Downing Street, really transparently bogus stories. And of course, I think there were people in the media at the time, certainly in the sort of the small, very small part of the liberal left media that was actually saying, there is really no reason to go to war here. And there were massive protests, but there was also the sinking feeling that, this war is unstoppable, and that the powerful people in charge of this war had decided that it was going to go ahead, and there was nothing to be done. And I think after that, the revelations that there were no weapons of mass destruction, and then, of course, this other event that you talk about, the total lack of accountability, the fact that people who advocated that war, who actually produced this figure that you mentioned, this journalist, who actually published a story in the New Yorker, which was later proven to be utterly false. That person receives a promotion. He moves from being a journalist to being the editor of The Atlantic.
The New Yorker, by the way, has never apologised for that.
No, none of these.
No one's apologised. I mean, that's the nature of it, isn't it?
Absolutely. So I think, I'm not at all surprised that many of those same periodicals are now complicit in, in a campaign of, if not outright propaganda, then certainly in a campaign that involves omission or propaganda by omission. Just don't report a lot of things that, show Israel in a bad light. I think, going back to your question, that really was a huge setback for people who believed in the power of demonstrations, who believed in the power of democratic dissent. These protests, the protests against the destruction of Gaza, I think are being spearheaded or have been spearheaded by a younger generation that doesn't have the bitter memories of the failed protests against the war in Iraq. These are people who are exposed, and mind you, digital media wasn't so advanced back in 2003. Today, thanks to digital technologies, you can see live-streamed massacres. You can see the kind of things human beings have not witnessed ever before in history. Unparalleled atrocities. And I think for many people who are not particularly well informed about the history of that region, the most oppressive question is why? What justifies this? What justifies the killing of nearly 20,000 children? So they're asking very basic sort of questions. How does Israel enjoy this impunity to commit endless massacres, to commit endless crimes? So I don't think when they go out and demonstrate or set up encampments, they are thinking that this is going to stop as a result of their encampments. I think what they're really doing is expressing their disgust at the way this war has been prosecuted, the way the respectable elders have not only supported this but also enabled it, the way university administrators have sought to crack down on student protesters. I think it's an expression of moral outrage over a great abomination. I don't think it's very, politically oriented in the way, for instance, the anti-Iraq war protests were.
Your book talks a lot about media outlets, academic institutions, politicians, and many in elite Western society. You're talking mostly about the US and the UK, but it's certainly equally relevant here in Australia, who both support Israel but also demonise backers of Palestine or Gaza. Talk about the solidarity with Israel. Where do you think this comes from? What exactly is that saying? And how it signals, if you agree with this, a growing divide between those who advocate for Israel, the far right, evangelicals, the elite media, and many politicians, though not all, and many in the wider community who are outraged about what they're seeing day after day after day. Some are protesting, some are not. There seems to be a widening gulf that arguably has existed for a long time, but I would argue has never been so broad. So just talk a little bit about where you think this comes from.
I think, Anthony, in the last couple of months, we've entered a different phase altogether. But let's go back a little bit. I think the original sort of instinctive sympathy for Israel was really prompted by a profound sense of, just the horrific crimes that were committed in the late 30s, 1930s and 40s against the Jewish population of Europe. And there was a recognition, really broadly shared, that the state of Israel emerged as a kind of moral necessity. And then that sympathy continued over a long period, even as Israel became an expansionist power, became a colonialist power. Obviously there was a very deliberate attempt to create large constituencies, pro-Israel constituencies across the Western world. Various organizations were responsible for this very deliberate creation, and I talk about them in my book. And you have several generations of politicians now who've emerged with this, who have grown up with this particular narrative. And so someone like Biden, who's a sort of who's a kind of fanatical Zionist. He's grown up with that narrative that started to take shape in the United States from the 1970s onwards. But I think different things have been happening in, let's say, the last 10, 15 years, where simultaneously we see the far right emerge with much, much greater power and influence in large parts of Europe, in the United States very clearly now, and in Israel. And Israel, for many majoritarian nationalists, for various ethno-nationalists, has come to represent both a culture of cruelty and impunity that they would like to emulate in their own societies. And this is the most sinister mode of identification with Israel, not the kind of sympathy I started out with, not the kind of sympathy that many people in the West started out with of Israel as a shelter, as a necessary refuge for the survivors of the Holocaust. But Israel as a place where all kinds of things that are no longer possible in Europe, that are no longer possible in America, are now possible. And that is the most disturbing, the most sinister side of the far-right kind of identification and affiliation with Israel. Today you see some of the worst politicians in the world today, from Argentina's Milei or Bolsonaro, Donald Trump, Orban, kind of the worst anti-Semites in the world are standing shoulder to shoulder with Netanyahu and his sort of far-right cabinet of ethnic
And Israel
cleansers.
welcomes that, to be clear. Israel openly welcomes that anti-Semitism.
Just yesterday there was a report in Haaretz about how the Israeli foreign minister is now reopening contact with various anti-Semitic parties in Europe.
Yeah.
So I think the whole sort of as I said, just in the last couple of months, several realities have come to light more forcefully. They were always there. We weren't able to see them clearly, but those who have been following this can now see that Israel is now part of a very large and resurgent far-right political, emotional, and intellectual formation. Just yesterday, the vote in the United Nations, or 2 days back, where Israel voted with the United States and North Korea against Ukraine's right to its territory, just truly extraordinary. That a country that started off as a socialistic, left-leaning, egalitarian state is now really, the icon of far-rightists everywhere around the world.
I'll come back to some of those issues around Trump a bit later, because we can't ignore the orange elephant in the room. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about India and Israel. Many people maybe aren't aware that these two countries now are incredibly close. The biggest purchaser of weapons every year from Israel is India, about 45%. So it's a defence relationship, but it's also, as you discuss in the book, an ideological alignment that both nations, talking about Modi, the Prime Minister of India, and Netanyahu in Israel, though it goes beyond those two leaders, have a shared belief in India, a Hindu fundamentalist government, and in Israel, a Jewish supremacist regime. And as someone who's reported on this for a long time myself, I was in India last year doing some reporting, particularly in just as a one short example for those to get a sense of what this means. I was in Punjab state, but not that far from Delhi. And there are Sikh farmers that have been protesting there for a while over crop prices. And in February last year, they were attacked by police and paramilitary forces, and there were tear gas dropped from drones that injured a number of people. And the farmers at the time were not aware of this, but it became clear soon afterwards, and I reported on this amongst a few other people, that the Indian officials got the idea of dropping tear gas from drones on farmers from Israel. And these officials had been to Israel in 2018. They had seen what Israel was doing in Gaza during the Great March of Return, which was an attempt to have Palestinians in Gaza march peacefully for their rights. And Israel had battle tested that essentially in Gaza, and Indian officials liked that idea, and fast forward many years and they're trying it and using it on Indian farmers. So I wanted to ask you a little bit to explain to an audience, what is this relationship? You talk in the book about historically India was often, though not always, supportive of Palestine, at least in theory. that's obviously changed quite a lot. So just explain a bit about what that relationship looks like in the 2020s.
Well, I mentioned earlier that I grew up in a family of Hindu nationalists who were felt very close to Israel and wanted India to emulate Israel. Today, the largest sort of fan base of Netanyahu, for instance, is in India. And it consists entirely of Hindu nationalists who, again, have the same sort of sympathy and sense of identification with Israel, that Israel knows how to treat its minorities, how to deal with Muslims in particular, in the only language Muslims supposedly understand, which is, force and more force. So this is the biggest sort of emotional connection that many Hindu supremacists have with Jewish supremacists, that they've really figured out, how to construct a strong nation state and how to deal with internal and external enemies, who happen to be Muslims in both cases. And it's on that basis, very strong basis, that a diplomatic and military relationship has now been built, especially over the last 10 years or so. You mentioned the drones, there are various other instances. I know personally people whose iPhones were infected by the spying software the Indian government bought from Israel. In Kashmir, which is under a state of military occupation, has been for a long time very much a disputed territory. The Indian government has adopted many Israeli counterinsurgency measures. Various Israeli experts have been deployed for this purpose. So there is a flourishing military security, and now a very close kind of geopolitical relationship. And I think, again, you can see how the history that India had as a very strong supporter of Palestinian rights has no real bearing here anymore. And this is why I'm saying we are moving into a different phase altogether, where various ethnic, religious supremacists, various fanatics are coming together on these sort of platforms, all with a survivalist mentality, all with the conviction that might is right and that they shall prevail and the weak must suffer. And I think it matters very little, where they came out of, what the previous policy of the Indian government was, what the original basis for, sympathy or global sympathies for Israel were. What's really important is that here is a state that embodies a certain kind of 19th century social Darwinism perfectly. And this is really now going to be our model.
You said before we came on that you don't read the reviews of your books when your book comes out, which I really admire. But I wanted to ask you one, so he does read them, but in a few months, not right when the book comes out. But there was a recent review in The Guardian in the UK, and I just wanted to...
Good or bad?
Well, both. It was both. And I'm not here to... Obviously, I didn't write the review, just to be clear. I just wanted to ask you, there's something that the reviewer challenges you on, and I suspect you've maybe had this criticism from others. So I just wanted to ask you to respond to it. He essentially says that the book is good, but it doesn't really allow for sympathy for Jews. And he says this at the end. I'm just quoting him. I'm not saying I believe this, to be clear. Do Hamas's victims anyway always slot into Mishra's race categories as white? Israel's response, we can agree, has been horrific and may constitute ethnic cleansing and even a new genocide, but don't the Jewish dead also count? That's how the review ends. Now, I only mention that because I think there is a strain of thinking on this issue, which you would know very well. Your book touches on this, that by writing sympathetically, critically about Israel, you are almost ipso facto have no sympathy for Jews or Jewish suffering, Jewish death. Now, I'm not particularly asking you to reference this, respond to the review. You haven't read the review, but just hearing that kind of comment, what do you think when obviously you rolled your eyes, which I would too, but how do you respond to that?
I mean, obviously, whoever this reviewer is has not clearly read the book.
Yes, well, you can
or
take
has
it up with him,
formed
but yes.
a extremely sort of distorted idea of it, because I think the book describes that at some length, just how the state of Israel, and I know that there are people who are critical of what they see and as an excessively sympathetic account of the state of Israel in this book. And they've been critical of that and saying, I don't, actually create too much space for Palestinians in the narrative, and that I'm indifferent to their plight. So there is also that criticism to be considered. And I think, those kinds of polarized opinions are inevitable when you write on a subject like this, which from the very beginning has been marked by, intense, vicious ideological, intellectual disagreement. My first editor in the United States, when I first sort of told him that I wanted to write about this subject, he said, don't. It's the most masochistic thing you can do as a writer. And I remember his words very clearly. He said, it's like banging your head against a wall. You'll be inevitably misunderstood. Your writings will inevitably be distorted. And it's just not, worth it. I mean, I still ended up writing it, I suppose, out of an inner compulsion. But I have no doubt that, once a book like this travels into the world, it will attract all kinds of opinion, and a lot of those opinions will not actually be based on a reading of the book.
You talk a lot in the book about a hatred and racism against Arabs, against Palestinians, which obviously is a recurring theme, both in your book but also clearly in modern day. You quote, and I had not heard this quote before, the famed foreign correspondent Martha Gellhorn, who did a lot of amazing work in her life. However, I know she was a big supporter of Israel. She said when reporting on Palestinian refugees in 1961, quote, Arabs gorge on hate, they roll in it, they breathe it. Which is about as dehumanising you can get. And it reminded me of a quote that I wanted to briefly read from Jesse Waters, who's a so-called leading Fox News host, if you can use those two terms together. He said last week, and I quote, I wrote this down, this population in Palestine is hostile, it's uneducated. It's even more radicalised than they were at the beginning of this. I mean, now they have no homes at all. They're even more hateful than the Israelis. And their birth rate is explosive. The average Palestinian woman has 5.5 babies. The average Israeli woman has only 2.5 babies. So demographically, they're a threat. Not to mention the national security threat. That's the end of the quote. And someone rightly said, that's basically Nazi-like rhetoric. There's no other way to explain that. I guess my question in a way is, has anything changed? The first quote, obviously you didn't quote Jesse Waters in the book, but has anything changed, and actually is it getting worse, or is that underlying level of profound hatred, dehumanisation just been a constant in much of Western thought, certainly in the last 50, 60 years?
Yeah, I think I would partly explain it with reference to, again, kind of very rapid far-right consolidation in places like the United States. I would include, also Australia, Canada, the old sort of settler colonies in this category. I think the racial passions of the 19th century have re-emerged with a vehemence that has surprised and shocked many of us. You thought that enough social progress had been made, and that liberalism, or social liberalism at least, had secured some important victories, and racism, or at least overt racism of this kind, was broadly in retreat. But we now know that to be untrue, and this is a profoundly disorienting experience for many of us, and I include myself in that category, who had, even after growing up with narratives in places like India. I grew up in India, and obviously we were told that the British Empire was both racist and also deeply corrupt. And that, it was possible still at the same time to look at England or look at Britain and say, okay, this is now, becoming a multicultural society where racism is frowned upon, racism might even lose you your job. And today you see racism mainstream platformed at the highest levels of government, in the media. So I think the contempt for Palestinian lives is not something that is driven by, anti-Palestinian animus alone. I think some very dark, deeper forces are driving this kind of rhetoric. These sort of, quasi-genocidal impulses are now extremely widely shared across, politicians and journalists and businessmen across the Western world, and indeed, large parts of the non-Western world too, against the minorities. And we need to be much, much more alert than we have been to this. And that's why I keep saying that. That's why the book is titled The World After Gaza, because the world is a very different place if you think about, if you ponder, if you reflect on what was said during the eradication of Gaza by mainstream politicians, by Israeli politicians, and the lengths to which people went to condone and justify and also to provision crimes against humanity. I think there's no question we are heading towards a very, very kind of a new dark age. I'm sorry to be so downbeat, but I think there's no other conclusion to be drawn from the widespread prevalence of this kind of rhetoric today.
I mean, when you say that, obviously it's always dangerous as a writer to look into a crystal ball, but what do you mean when you're saying that? What are you imagining potentially? You're thinking that no one's learned anything from the last 70, 80 years and therefore nothing's inevitable, but likely that sort of mass killings, which obviously what's happening in Gaza and beyond is likely? I mean, what do you mean when you say that?
I think, first of all, just look at that situation alone. The continuous war in Lebanon, despite the so-called ceasefire, continuous dispossession of Palestinians in the West Bank, continuous killing of people in Gaza, continuous bombardment of Syria. Now, any of those situations, any of those confrontations can spark a broader conflagration. I think, it's still possible that Israel will attack Iran, setting off a larger war in the region. We can't really rule that out at all at this point, with Trump basically backing Netanyahu all the way.
Yeah.
There is that situation. We see, again, the far right surging across Europe, and politicians, even of the center left, like in the UK, scrambling to make themselves sound more and more like the far right, and introducing policies that, a previous generation of Labour politicians would have absolutely recoiled from in horror. And these are the policies that people like Keir Starmer are now embracing, proudly advocating. So I think at this point, nothing can be ruled out. When the far right speaks of mass deportations, when the recently elected German chancellor speaks of mass deportations, and before him, the Social Democrat chancellor spoke of mass deportations. I think, I would not want to spell it out, but again, anything is possible.
During Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982, and you have a section in your book discussing this, Ronald Reagan, who was a lover of war criminals the world over, let's face it, used the word Holocaust to describe Israel's brutal actions. So obviously hearing that, it's inconceivable that any Western politician, let alone, frankly, any journalist, would likely use that word today to describe Israeli actions, although others obviously are using that word now. The response by Israel, of course, was apoplexy, as it usually is, accusing Reagan of using a blood libel against the Jewish people. Talk a little bit about the tactic that is regularly used in US, UK and many Western circles, including in Australia. the weaponization of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is real, it's a disease, it exists, it's in some places of the world getting worse. There's real anti-Semitism, no doubt about that, and it worries many of us who are Jews and obviously those who are not. But talk a bit about what the end goal seems to be, weaponizing anti-Semitism in the service of occupation, endless war in Gaza, genocide.
No, I think anyone who writes about this subject is at risk, of course, of inviting that charge that you are fundamentally an anti-Semite who's trying to disguise his or her criticism of Israel as sort of principled anti-imperialism. I think through dint of sheer repetition and I would say unscrupulous use, they've ended up in a way almost depriving this accusation of the potency it should have, because as you say, anti-Semitism is real. It's not only, around us, it's actually surging. It's actually surging. And when you make light of this in this way, by treating perfectly valid criticism of the state of Israel or the regime of Israel, by denouncing it as anti-Semitism, you are basically turning away from the real problem that is around us and becoming more and more serious by the day. So I think I've been accused of anti-Semitism, and I have to say I'm perfectly indifferent to the charge because I feel that it doesn't really have the same kind of potency it once did. And that is very dangerous. That's really very dangerous. People should feel truly shaken by it because we know where anti-Semitism leads to. History has provided us with too much horrific evidence. And yet we are becoming too blasé about this and leveling this charge at people who are simply trying to make a criticism of Israel that actually in a way is pointing to, that criticism is pointing to a political future where Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace. That is at least the political intention behind this criticism. It is not to dismantle the state of Israel. It's not to single out the Jewish population of Israel or the Jewish population elsewhere as some sort of unique historical villains. It is to say these policies are wrong and that they can only lead to further bloodshed and strife, and that you cannot solve this problem through force, and that you have to accommodate Palestinian rights and Palestinian and rights to dignity and freedom.
Which ties into my next question around Germany. And Germany, I would probably argue, in the Western world at least, is probably the most repressive, at least now, in being against any display of Palestine solidarity. People might not know about this in this room. It doesn't get nearly enough attention in the West. But talk a little bit about what this so-called memory culture is. Essentially, Germany says, because of their history, that we have a responsibility to protect Jews and remember what our ancestors did. And that, in theory, is actually a good thing. However, it's been weaponized in the service of, for example, the second biggest provider of weapons to Israel is Germany after the US. And there is mass arrests of people peacefully protesting in Germany, particularly since October 7, although it existed before. Just tell people a little bit about what is going on in Germany, which I think has kind of moved to a moment of almost madness. And that's probably only going to get worse with the government that's soon to be formed there.
Absolutely. But there's a long chapter on Germany in the book because I thought it was very important to draw attention to this aspect. I think the deformations of the memory of the Holocaust are most striking in the case of Germany, which actually obviously committed this monstrous crime, never properly purged itself of Nazism. Senior Nazis were promoted, they were absorbed into the ruling class, the German ruling class, the West German ruling class, and many of those Nazis also obviously became extremely useful to the Americans, to the so-called free world, during its confrontation with Soviet communism. So a country that had not truly reckoned with its criminal past found that it could actually become respectable again by becoming close to Israel, by entering into this, very sinister pact, which, I think I quote the Israeli philosopher who said that, basically the Germans are seeking, some kind of a indulgence from us while providing us with cash and weapons, an extremely cynical arrangement, and there is a lot of scholarly evidence now in some recent books about this, about the way the German Chancellor and the Israeli Prime Minister went about creating this alliance. And again, both sort of recognizing that actually there are certain subjects that we should not be talking about, such as the persistence of the Nazi kind of officials in the West German regime. And in recent decades, that sort of commitment to Israel has become a much more cynical and sinister exercise than even before. Arms deals, selling huge quantities of arms, making huge amounts of money, while claiming that the defense of Israel is one of the German state's primary tasks, in fact the reason for its being, and enacting various sort of rituals of remembrance. This is all relatively recent. The Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, these are all recent constructions. The way in which the Holocaust is now absorbed into German memory and people insist on it. I think there's a lot of cynicism there, especially manifest in the arms deals, for instance. You see that cynicism in other memory cultures too, and you saw that really shockingly in the case of the NATO chief who was the current NATO chief, the Dutch fellow, the former prime minister, who was actively involved, as you might remember, in suppressing evidence that Israelis were committing crimes against humanity in Gaza, because he knew this would not play well if it came out with the Americans, who are responsible for appointing him the chief of NATO. And Dutch civil servants, many of them, not at all radical, not at all, just conventional bureaucrats who were appalled by this enough to write a public letter. Not a public letter, internal letter that was leaked to the press. So you see again, people saying, oh, criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, we must crack down on these dissenters, we must stand with Israel, but advancing their careers at the same time, making money at the same time. And this cheapening of what should be a very sacred memory of the crimes committed against the European Jewish population is again, one of the most disturbing things about this current episode of violence.
Let me ask you one last question before I get to audience questions. What do you see? Maybe you would argue that your book is your answer, but what is the role of an intellectual, a writer in these times? Obviously, there's a multitude of issues. Gaza is not the only issue in the world, of course. We deal with a deeply far-right nativist American government, growing allies around the world, which you've touched on tonight and you've written about. What is the role? Obviously there are some examples of someone like Orwell who went to the Spanish Civil War. I'm not suggesting one goes to fight. I'm just saying there are people who do different things. What do you see as the role of a thoughtful intellectual in these times?
Anthony, with questions like that, I feel like, there's an expectation that I'll say something uplifting.
No, God no. I'm not that guy, trust me. I'm not the uplifting guy. No. Don't worry.
But, I have a great sense of futility, really. I wrote this book because I felt so oppressed by, this sort of everyday violence that you saw. And even though I'm not on social media, I try and limit my consumption of the news. But even then, I was continuously exposed to these horrific images coming out of Gaza. And not only that, but also the way in which, the newspapers I read, the magazines I've written for, were continuously suppressing that evidence that was staring us all in the face. So the only thing I could do was, basically write. That's what I'm trained to do. There's nothing else I can do. I'm not at all sure of the utility of any of what I've written, or whether it'll go anywhere whatsoever, in changing things. I think the kind of role intellectuals used to play back in the 1930s, you quoted, you cited George Orwell. I think we're in a very different phase now.
Yeah.
And the kind of straightforward appeal to individual conscience that was possible, could be resonant back in the 1930s or so, today is drowned out by the noise of various forms of media, both legacy media, social media, and these massive ecosystems of disinformation that we've all come to inhabit, and deliberate misreadings. You cited one aspect of it, so the Guardian review, which I'm still going to wait for a couple of months before reading.
Amazing! Wow, I'd be rushing to read it.
I'm becoming less and less confident of our ability as intellectuals, as writers, to change things. I think because as ordinary citizens, I think we all live with now a great sense of impotence. We are now run by monstrous systems, and the Elon Musk, I think is probably the most the most vivid and monstrous embodiment of these kinds of impersonal forces that are taking over our lives. But I think the role of writing, the role of argumentation, the role of prose, the role of art, all this is under question like never before. And I think I would be lying if I said, that it wasn't.
We have 10 minutes left. I have some questions. Let me ask you, they've been rated by you people, so I'm just choosing some ones here. How could Israel have been, I think you said, a socialist, left-leaning, egalitarian state at the outset when the mass expulsion and genocide of Palestinians happened in 1948?
Well, I think, it's possible for countries, like India is a very good example of it, to maintain or to at least uphold a socialistic or egalitarian ethos, while at the same time engaging in, extremely violent acts of repression, which it did, in its early years, and continue to do so much later too. I don't think there's a great sort of contradiction here, because you can always say that socialism only for citizens, everyone else is a slave, or is someone who should be treated really badly. So you can always, legislate in a way that extends democratic rights or an egalitarian ethos to only some people and deny them to the rest.
Why is there a refusal of media outlets to mention anything before October 7, 2023? It's as though it happened in a vacuum. Maybe that's sort of answered the question, but yeah, why do you think there seems to be? There obviously are exceptions, but often there is everything started on that day.
Yeah, I think, it partly has to do with the fact that a lot of people, and I say this very bluntly, a lot of journalists who work in these mainstream media outlets, whether it's TV channels or newspapers, are extremely poorly educated people. They have not bothered to inform themselves of the histories of the places they write about. I hesitate to introduce any kind of anecdotal evidence here, but a friend of mine told me about a new editor at The Economist who's going out to cover a particular continent. Probably best to keep this person anonymous. And this person is now the editor of this entire continent and had never visited that continent before. Did not even know that Zanzibar was part of Africa. So we are looking at really levels of historical illiteracy And this is something it's not talked about, because who's going to talk about it? You know, journalists themselves are not going to talk about this. They don't want to betray their colleagues. But I come across again and again astounding levels of ignorance. This is a very charitable interpretation. The other interpretation, of course, is, you know, that many of these people are simply malicious and you know, are too prejudiced really to report the truth about these situations.
What do you think will happen to Gaza and the West Bank?
It's, you know, something I prefer not to think about, because I'm overwhelmed with various bleak scenarios when I think about it. I think what is happening right now is horrific enough.
I wanted to ask you just also, we have a few minutes left, around, we've touched a little bit on Trump. It's obviously hard to ignore the elephant in the room in a way, or the orange man in the room, however you want to call him. I mean, he's obviously a singular figure in so many different ways, and he's only been in power for just over a month. We talked about tonight, and you've spoken elsewhere about the growing quasi-coalition of far-right forces, and he's a sort of leader of sorts of that. I know we discussed before about your dark thoughts about where this is all going, and I sadly share those views. But just talk a little bit more about what you think seems to be happening with the election of someone like Trump. He remains, I mean, he's only been in power, as I said, for a month, but remains pretty popular a month in. Talk about some of those issues. I'm not just talking about Palestine here, I'm saying more in general that we have an election here soon and there is a Trump-like figure who may be Prime Minister within a couple of months here, according to the polls. I'm only saying what the polls say, people. Just talk a little bit about that.
You know, I think we are kind of witnessing a very major, you know, sort of world historical shift here, where the countries that were once popular, not popular, powerful in the, my jet lag might be kicking in at this stage. In the 19th century, the countries that you could define as a sort of winners of history, you know, the United Kingdom, United States, Australia to a great extent, people who had it relatively easy and were able to find territories and resources in different parts of the world, settle them in many instances, create sort of prosperous societies. They are now faced with relative decline, you know, not sort of, you know, rapid decline, but they're certainly losing the kind of power they once enjoyed. And I think that has sparked off. I'm speaking very broadly here. You know, obviously there are many local things driving this, you know, economic crises and inflation, all of these things. Yes. But I think when we look at the assertion of the far right and the ideologies driving this sort of, you know, surge, we're looking at profound existential insecurities on the part of people who have lorded it over the world for a long time and feel that power is slipping away and are becoming more and more desperate, more and more, let's say, uninhibited in their rhetoric, in their policies, letting go of the liberal platitudes that helped mask them before, abandoning every kind of gesture to humanitarianism, every kind of claim to moral superiority. These are all signs of desperation. These are signs of people who are losing power and are resorting to, you know, the lowest means available to them at this stage. That's how I would describe, you know, Trump and the people who are lining up behind him, because they see this as a last chance to consolidate a kind of power that they feel is challenged both internally by populations that are increasingly diverse, populations where women have a larger role to play. I think the role of misogyny and you know, in general, the distrust of feminism, the hatred of feminism should not be underestimated here. A lot of the Trump phenomena is, I think, almost a direct response to the very small victories of the Me Too movement and the BLM movement. I think the sense that people had gone too far, that woke had gone too far, that too many powerful men were under threat for their horrific behavior. This is something, really driving this phenomenon. Not surprising that, a man accused of rape is now the President of the United States and is now immune to those charges. So I think one must not underestimate the social advances, the role that, even the small victories of the feminist movements or the anti-racist movements, the kind of insecurities, the existential insecurities they have triggered among some of the most powerful people in the world today.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our amazing guest.
Thank you.
I just remember I didn't introduce myself at the beginning, which is a really bad host thing to do. My name is Antony Loewenstein. I'm a journalist and most recently the author of the Palestine Laboratory. This man's amazing book, The World After Gaza, is available for sale at the back. You should buy 10 copies each. Christmas is 11 months away. Get in early. My book is also available there and we'll be signing upstairs. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for Wheeler for hosting. Thank you for coming.